there's so many people, uh, Ed, that are considering looking into fulfilled prophecy. They've never heard of AD 70, but now they're beginning to hear of AD 70. And I know you've studied it pretty in depth. And when I first came across uh, Ed, fulfilled prophecy, I just began searching, and somehow your then and now podcast came up in my searches, and I had never heard of you. I clicked on the podcast. I think I listened to David Chilton's, I guess, message, teaching, sermon that he had on there from years ago, and then I started listening to a lot of your podcast as well. So that led me on my journey for sure.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. So my goal here, Ed, is just to, I think we have this recording. I think it's already set up. Yep. Yeah. My goal is to get your story. Being raised in church, as you know, if you were raised in church as a child, your journey to where you are now in your eschatology, the views that you hold, why you hold them, and then maybe any words of encouragement to just the average believer who's been in church for most of their lives, who've had never heard of AD 70. They've really never heard of the rapture already being fulfilled.
Right.
And they're beginning to hear this. And to them, it seems like heresy. It seems like false teaching. But the more I looked into it, it's biblical. It's supported by the biblical narrative.
Yep,
And
it
so many
is.
verses.
It is
So I'm
the
going to turn it
biblical
over to
view.
you.
It is the biblical view. Thank you, Brad. Appreciate it. Great to meet you and see you in person and get to know you a little bit better. Looking forward to our future interaction some more. I've got a copy of my little book, What Happened in 70 AD, and I sent you a PDF copy of that. So feel free to give that out to any of your listeners or viewers. They can have that. And I think that will give them a real good introduction to the overall preterist view. When I grew up in Sunray, Texas, which is near Amarillo, Texas, and lived there for my first 20 years of my life. And I grew up on a farm in Texas, wheat farm, and I was faithful to the Baptist church every time the doors were open, 3 times a week or more, any special meetings as well. And I remember all the way up from birth, sitting on my mother's knee and her singing, Jesus loves me, this I know. And I remember that way back, probably when I was a year old and later. And so from an early age, I was very much aware that Jesus loved me and that he had a wonderful plan for my life.
Mhm.
So when I got 6 years old, there was a Baptist preacher in town for a gospel meeting, and he extended the invitation. I wanted to go up and be baptized, but my mom wouldn't let me. She says, "Oh no, you're not old enough yet. You don't understand enough." And so she made me wait for about 3 years. But uh, 3 years later, when I was 9 years old, another preacher came to town and extended a gospel invitation at the end of his sermon. And because I wasn't sitting with my mom, she couldn't grab me. And I ran up to the front of the auditorium, and he took my confession and baptized me into Christ. And so that was probably just about the happiest day of my life at that point. And then when I got into high school, I started reading the Bible a lot and read it all the way through in high school. But I didn't really study it very much. It was just basically reading it. But I was very familiar with with all the events, all the major characters, anyway, because of going to Bible school, Bible class in the Baptist church. So I pretty much understood the historical, panorama, the whole flow of biblical history at that point. And so when I got to college, I decided to, sit down and study through the Bible, not just read it, but to study through it, look up all the places on the maps, and, have a timeline in front of me so that I could see, the flow of each book, where each book fits into the overall historical framework. And that was an amazing, richly rewarding study. I read the whole Bible through twice in 6 months. Now, you know that takes a lot of reading every day. That would be 4 chapters a day if you want to read it in a whole year. So it'd be 8 chapters a day if you want to read it in 6 months. And it'd be 16 chapters a day if you want to read the whole Bible twice in 6 months.
It's a lot of reading.
16 chapters at least. I usually average about 20, so I made it through there. But in the process of studying that, I really was challenged. When I got through the second time, studying through it, not just reading, but studying through it, looking up the places and seeing how that book fits into the overall perspective. As I closed the book of Revelation that second time, I bowed my head and I prayed to God, if there's one thing I want you to do for me in my life, is to help me understand the book of Revelation.
Mhm.
Because it was confusing. I really could not get a handle on what that book was all about. And so within 2 weeks of that prayer, uh, I was down the hall in the dormitory at the college, and there was a friend of mine down there who was a theology major, and he was planning to go to Dallas Theological Seminary after he graduated. And he had a tremendous head start on theological library. And I was kind of browsing through his books in the bookshelf there in the dorm room, and I noticed this big, oversized book with the name Josephus on it.
Mhm.
And all growing up through my childhood, I had never heard of Josephus, didn't even know what that book was. And so I pulled it off the shelf and I said, "What is Josephus? What is this all about?" And he said, "Oh, he was a Jewish priest in the first century, and he traveled with Titus, the Roman general, and recorded the history of the Jewish war with Rome. And he was there at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and recorded an eyewitness account of it." And I said, "What? What are you talking about?" I knew that the temple was no longer there in Jerusalem, but I didn't know when it was destroyed and how. And so he told me, he gave me a good overview of Josephus and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And that really made sense. For the first time, I began to understand, a little bit about Jewish history in the first century, and it really inspired me. Up until that point, I hated history. But when I found out the biblical history, the New Testament history, that really made a lot of sense. And he told me, Matthew 24 talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. So I went and started studying Matthew 24. And because I had already read through the book of Revelation a couple of times, I could see the similarity between Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation. And so I went over to the library at Texas Tech University where I was and checked out every commentary they had on the book of Revelation and Matthew 24 as well, and started reading them, but just still did not make much sense to me. And I went down to the bookstore, Christian bookstore, and got a few commentaries there on the book of Revelation, read them, devoured them, studied them. And then I went over to another Christian bookstore there in Lubbock, Texas, and I found this book by Foy Wallace. I'll show it to you here.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen that, the Book of Revelation by Foy Wallace.
Have never even heard of him. Yeah, okay.
He's a Church of Christ preacher, and he wrote back in the 1930s, I think, this commentary. And I started not to even buy it because I'd already spent my monthly or yearly allowance on other commentaries on Revelation. So it was a difficult choice. So I went and started looking through it, looking through the opening pages to see if there was any reason for me to buy another commentary. And so I noticed that he spends about 40, maybe a little bit over that, 50 pages in the beginning talking about the date of the writing of the book of Revelation. And none of the other commentaries I had read spend more than a page or two on the date. But this guy was spending 40 pages or more on the date. And I said, what's so important about the date? What difference does it make? So I said, well, let me plop down there in the bookstore between the aisles, and I opened up the book and started reading. And I got about 15 pages into that commentary, and I said, wow, the early date of Revelation. That makes a lot of sense. And so that hooked me. I had to buy that book, and I went right back to my dorm room and devoured that first 50 pages. And from that point on, I was hooked on the idea that the book of Revelation was discussing the downfall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so I was reading Josephus at that same time as well. And I noticed in Josephus that he talked about the Romans with their catapult, which would throw those stones over against the wall of Jerusalem. And it says, oh, by the way, the weight of those stones are about a talent each, which is about 80 pounds. And I remembered reading in the book of Revelation that there was a great hailstorm against this great city, Babylon. And John says, oh, by the way, in Revelation 16, the weight of those hailstones was about a talent each. And boy, I connected the dots right
Mm,
there. From that point on, I laid the book of Revelation out beside Josephus and started connecting more dots, as I went through. And that began my career as a partial preterist at that point.
mhm.
So I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but that's how I got into the preterist view.
Yeah, it's kind of like all of our journeys, Ed. It starts with somebody reading something or somebody hearing something or somebody picking up a book, and it just begins this journey into scripture and to research and to studying. And along the way, we begin to change our views of eschatology. Revelation begins to make a little bit more sense to us. And then we find other people who've made the same journey, which is how I connected with you. You're just years ahead of me, and I'm so thankful for your studies. So after you begin making these connections with Josephus, um, which is fascinating because he was, if I remember right, he was a priest, like you say. He was Jewish. He was a priest, like John the Baptist, and he became a general within the Jewish army in
Right.
Galilee, and he put up such a fight against the Roman army that he's the only one they kept alive.
Yeah.
And I think that was in God's sovereignty to record that history. So take it from there, Ed, with your connections with Josephus, and then keep developing your story for us. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. After I, got into Josephus and reading the Bible through and trying to connect the dots, soon after that, I enrolled in the seminary there in Lubbock, Texas, Sunset School of Preaching. And I found out that two of my professors there took all of Matthew 24 as one unit, one unit. They didn't divide Matthew 24 into two separate events, one in 70 AD and one still in the future. And so that was very interesting for me. That kind of brought me into the circle quite a bit. But back when I was at Texas Tech University, I got involved in the Campus Crusade for Christ group. Very nice group, very good Christian evangelistic group. I went on a lot of evangelistic studies there in the dormitory with people and helped them understand Christianity. So that was a real good experience. But they took our group out to Arrowhead Springs, California, which is in Los Angeles area, where's the headquarters of Campus Crusade. And they took us out there because Hal Lindsey was going to be speaking at that conference. It's a leadership conference there for Campus Crusade. And so I got to hear Hal Lindsey right after he had written his book, Late Great Planet Earth. And he was talking about us being the terminal generation. And
Real
that
quick, Ed, what was that? Probably 1973, 74. When did he write that? Or
it was just maybe before he wrote it. This was 71 when I was there,
71. Okay.
1971. And but he probably already had that book in mind and was getting ready to write it. Maybe already written it and was waiting for it to be published. But anyway, he spoke on us being the terminal generation. And then he went to Matthew 24 and explained how that was talking about a generation off in the future that would be the terminal generation, which was us today. He was applying that to us today as being the terminal generation, the generation that Matthew 24 had looked forward to. And I had already studied enough Matthew 24 to realize, no, can't be.
Mhm.
Can't be. There's something wrong with that picture. And so I went back and studied Matthew 24. And that's why I was so delighted when I got into the seminary to hear that my professors, a couple of them, not all of them, but a couple of the professors there took Matthew 24 as one unit, all together as one event in 70 AD. So that was very encouraging. And one of the other professors also took 2 Peter 3 as referring to 70 AD. And that was a real challenge for me. I didn't quite know what to do with that. And it was probably not until after I got out of the seminary that I finally studied my way into that idea. But I was at least convinced on Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation being 70 AD. And so um, then in my last semester at the seminary, we were taking a course on the book of Revelation, which, boy, I was really looking forward to that all the way through. I was waiting for that day. But the professor did not take an early date. And he gave references to all kinds of commentaries that took the late date. And so I went up to him after class and I said, Foy Wallace is a Church of Christ commentary. And why are you recommending all these Baptist commentaries and Presbyterian commentaries that take a late date when you've got a Church of Christ guy right here in our denomination that takes the early date? Why don't you recommend his commentary? And he says, well, I don't agree with him. So that settled it. I dropped the subject and, went on from there. But I vowed to myself, when I get out of the seminary, I'm going to study this. And so during the course of that study on Revelation, we got to chapter 19, and the professor mentioned the spirit of prophecy. In Revelation 19, it talks about Jesus Christ is the spirit of prophecy. And he says, there's a guy, a preacher in the Church of Christ, who takes the position that he wrote a book on this title, The Spirit of Prophecy. He takes the position that the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD and referring to the destruction of Jerusalem as the downfall of the great harlot city, and that he believes that the second coming occurred in 70 AD. Wow, that was a new wrinkle in the picture here for me. So, and he said, by the way, that guy is coming to the seminary today to drop off the next installment in his debate with one of the other seminary professors. And I said, wow. So I saw a guy that looked like him there in the hallway later that day. And I said, are you Max King? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, I'd like to get a copy of your book. So he took me out to his car and gave me a copy of his book. And I sent him a check the next day so he would not think I was taking a free book off of him. And so I got to reading in that book. And of course, I was still in the seminary. I could not move into the full preterist view at that point. It would have made a little bit of trouble for me. But I vowed, whenever I get out of the seminary, I'm going to revisit all this and take another look at it. And I did. And so after graduating from the seminary, I went to Long Island, New York, to join up with another preacher there of the seminary. And he was a senior pastor, and he took me on as an assistant pastor. And 2 weeks after I got there, he called me over to his home. He says, won't you come over for supper? I got something I want to talk to you about. So I said, oh no, what have I done?
Those are, it's
And
like the Pharisees telling Jesus, "Hey, come on over. Let's talk." So, oh Lord, what's
yeah.
coming?
So I said, yeah, I'm game for a free meal anytime. So I went over, and after supper, we went into his study. We closed the door, and he says, I want to study with you. I want to share with you something I have come to understand.
Hmm.
And I said, well, what's that? And he says, well, I've been looking at Matthew 24. I taught a course on it here at the church back 6 months or so ago. And I come to the conclusion that Matthew 24 is all fulfilled in 70 AD, and including the second coming of Christ in 70 AD. And he looked at me ready for me to just explode, and attack him and clobber him for coming to some conclusion like that. And I said, no, no, that makes total sense. I've already convinced myself of the same thing, that there was some kind of coming in 70 AD. I don't see it as a second coming necessarily, but there was some kind of coming in judgment upon the Jewish nation spoken about in Matthew 24. And he says, well, let's study that. And so for the next 4 hours in, into 2 o'clock in the morning, he shared with me his journey into the full preterist view. And wow, I was just shaking my head all the way. This is new insights. I'd never had anybody explain this to
Mm.
me before. And so by the time we were through, I mean, he wore me down 2 o'clock in the night. I was just pooped out. So I was ready to believe anything. But he convinced me that Matthew 24 is referring to the second coming. And that really started putting all the pieces in place for me. The pieces of the puzzle started fitting, and we just went ransacking through the New Testament, saying, well, how does this passage fit? And how does this passage fit? And it really all fell together for me right there at that time. And so that was how it all came to be. And that was 50 years ago, by the way. 1975, in July or August of 1975. And so we've just hit the 20 or the 50-year mark just a month or so ago. It's
Mm.
amazing.
Perfect timing for our interview.
That's right. 50
Perfect
years.
timing. We'll keep going. I mean, this is fascinating to me. I love listening to people's stories, and I'm really interested in eschatology at this point in my life. And so you, 2 o'clock in the morning. Wow, second coming has happened. Take us from there. Take us. Keep sharing with us.
Well, as soon as I got through with that conversation, the next day when I finally got up and recovered from my late night studies, I called Max King, the guy who gave me that book, and I said, guess what, dude? I believe that the second coming occurred in 70 AD. And he says, well, congratulations. And so I started reading his book, and that really made a lot of difference for me. I began to put more pieces into place as a result of reading his book, The Spirit of Prophecy, because he goes through all those passages and he goes through the book of Revelation too, which I had really not done after I had become a full preterist. And so it was going through his book that really helped put a lot more pieces into place. And of course, uh, the church there was already convinced. So I didn't have any problems at the church uh, as long as I stayed, pretty close to what they had already understood. But then I got a chance to preach full time as the full minister at another church about 20 or 30 miles away in just on the outskirts of New York City in Malvern, Long Island, New York. And that church was not fully up to speed on the preterist view at that point. They were still looking at it, still somewhat um, skeptical of it. And so I had to dig a little bit deeper and study all this out a lot more so I could teach it to them and gradually share it with them. And they accepted it. There was no real problem because I took it slow. I didn't
Hmm.
rush into it, and I compared their view with this new view and showed them the differences and why we took the approach that we did. And that really helped, just taking it slow. I was there for 4 years, and it gave them plenty of time to understand all this. They asked lots of questions, and that was great because that helped me, study it out. Questions are great. I love it. And and then long about 1978, as I got more into the study of that, Max King invited me out to Ohio to participate in a debate with him and a couple of other guys against four different professors at the Ohio Valley Christian College. And I don't know if I was quite ready for a debate. I
Mhm.
was happy just answering the questions of my congregation at that point, but I agreed I'll go out and engage in debate on the subject of the judgment, the 70 AD judgment of Jerusalem. And very, very interesting debate. Max King spoke on the resurrection and his part of the debate. And that was the first time I ever heard anything about the resurrection being in 70 AD. I had not quite got to that point in my studies. I was still kind of thinking that the resurrection was still off in the future, at a future coming of Christ, maybe. But that really nailed it for me. He shared the resurrection view with me and showed why that had to be 70 AD. It could not have been still future because the time statements associated with the resurrection placed it right there at 70 AD at the second coming. And so I was really much encouraged by that and took that position. I already had the judgment, and you can't have a judgment in 70 AD unless those saints are raised first. And so that I said, yeah, to be consistent, I have to have a 70 AD resurrection so that they can be judged. And so that finished putting the pieces together for me. That
And
really
real
was,
quick,
yeah,
Ed, that resurrection would have been the resurrection of Daniel 12, which
exactly.
was the resurrection from Sheol or Hades, which
Right,
then is the resurrection and the judgment of Revelation 20.
right,
Okay.
exactly.
All
Yep.
right.
Yeah,
And
in Revelation 20, verses 13 through 15, he talks about all the souls, all the dead, being raised out of Hades and judged. So that's a good passage to go to see that. And
yeah.
that's what I had to understood as well.
And if
So,
anybody's watching a video or listening on a podcast, I go into this in my book, War on the Saints, Revelation Volume 2, the resurrection, Daniel 12, all of what we're talking about, because I think a lot of our audience is going to hear some of our terminology and they're not going to understand because they're not as far in the journey as we are, but I understand where they are because I used to be there.
yeah,
So,
yeah. And so
yeah,
did I 50 years ago.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. So go ahead, Ed.
Okay, so that was a very good debate. Learned a lot from that, and put a few more pieces into place as a result of that, and came back home and did more study, and really helped. And then uh, shortly after that, my supporting elders, because I had to raise support to go up to the mission church in New York. And so they did not have the funds there at the church to pay my full salary. And so I had a lot of churches down south supporting me. And somehow they heard that I had taken this strange view about the second coming in 70 AD. And so they asked me to come down to Texas and Oklahoma and meet with them and explain what that view was all about. And so I said, well, why don't I do this? I'll write a paper on that explaining it, and I'll send that down first and let you read it. And then when I get there, you can ask me some questions about it. And they said, oh, that'd be great. So I wrote a little book called What Happened in 70 AD.
Hmm.
just
Yes.
for those elders of my supporting congregations. And so I sent that down to them, and wow, wow, wow. That blew all the gaskets in their motor, I'll tell you. They had never in their life heard anything like that. That was just so way out there for them. They had a hard time understanding that. So, but at least they had an introduction to it, and that little booklet really helped them get a concept of what I was saying and why I was saying it. And so when I got there, they had lots and lots of questions. I don't think any of them were convinced, but at least they understood what I was teaching. And some of them were willing to go along with it and continue supporting me. And a couple of other churches said, no, I don't think so. I don't think we want to go along with that. But that, that was the parting of the ways for them. And they didn't have any hard feelings over it. They just, that because I assured them that this is not something that we have to part ways over as far as Christian fellowship. We can still be Christians and still fellowship each other, even though we disagree on this. And they said, well, yeah, that's true. Jesus didn't say that we have to hear the gospel, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized and understand that the second coming is still future in order to be saved. And I said, that's right. That's right. It's not a part of the gospel. It's not essential to our salvation. So we can, give each other freedom to differ on this issue. And so that was good. That really helped. And they continued to study it and read my book, and we continued to correspond. And eventually, the other churches just, you know, began to back off, and it was just too much for them. Just couldn't quite go there. But at least they didn't make it a test of fellowship, and they didn't call me a heretic or anything like that. So that was great. We parted ways on a good way, on a good note. So I think that gives you a pretty good overview on how I came into this understanding. I hope it's raised some questions for you, and feel free to ask some more questions.
Yeah, of course, the question I think I'm interested as your story is unfolding, and I think those who are listening or watching this interview centers around the rapture. Matter of fact, just before our interview this morning, Ed, I get a message through Facebook and somebody saying, "Hey, Brad, I've been listening to your teachings on the rapture, and I just, I enjoy your teachings, but I just can't accept what you're teaching about it." Um, so talk a little bit, Ed, about your journey into seeing and I hope I'm right on with this, that your view is the rapture took place around AD 66,
Right,
which would have been just before the beginning or right at the beginning of the Jewish-Roman War, which was 66 through 70,
right,
because the wrath of God toward unbelieving Israel, which is the second coming. So when we look back into the narrative, when Jesus talks about coming, he's talking about coming on the clouds, which is judgment language from the Hebrew Bible,
right,
which the audience that Jesus was talking to would have understood him to be saying, oh, he's talking about armies coming against us,
right.
because that's how the language was used in the Hebrew Bible. So take us through your understanding of the rapture.
Okay. Uh, Back in 1997, one of my supporters out in California had come to the conclusion by reading J.S. Russell's book, The Parousia. He had come to the conclusion that Russell was right, that there must have been a rapture in 70 AD. Russell does a really good job of explaining that in his book. I don't know if you've ever read that, but very good book on
It's called The Rapture of the Saints.
it's called The Parousia.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
Gotcha. The
J.S.
parousia.
Russell. And
Yes.
in there, he has a beautiful verse by verse discussion of all the second coming verses in the Bible, in the New Testament. And when he gets to First Thessalonians 4, he really opens up the rapture idea. And so my supporter out in California uh, wanted me to publish or reprint Russell's book. And he says, I want you to read Russell's book and see if you agree with it. And at that point, I was, you know, very skeptical about the rapture. And so he says, well, why don't you read Russell's book and see what he says and see if you can refute it? You refute it. Show me why I'm wrong in my belief that Russell's rapture position is right. So I said, okay, I'll do that. I'll read it. I'll refute it. So I tore into Russell's book and read through and then studied my way. I pulled out my Greek, looked every word in First Thessalonians 4 up in the Greek, studied it out very carefully. And by the time I got through with that study in the Greek of First Thessalonians 4, I said, that's talking about a catching up of those saints. No doubt about it. The Greek is very clear. And so that's when I really, locked onto it. And I started sharing it with some of my other friends in the Preterist movement. And they thought I was crazy. Nah, there's no rapture. Why? If there was a rapture, why didn't people see it? Why didn't people see those bodies floating up into the sky and the clothes left behind, and why didn't they notice that? And so I realized, I was going to have to answer their questions, because I had the same objections whenever I looked at it. And so I had to answer those same questions. And what I began to realize is that uh, Josephus is going to have us have the clues to this. I mean, if we're going to understand the rapture, we're going to have to go into Josephus and see how it fits into the overall historical framework of 70 AD. And I could not find anywhere in Josephus's narrative anything that even resembled a rapture or a resurrection in 70 AD. But I did notice in Josephus's comments about 66 AD, at the beginning of the war, all the different signs and angelic armies coming in the clouds, and the different they saw the face of a person in the sky above the temple, lasted for a whole night. And they saw the angelic armies in the sky just right after the war had begun, right after the revolt had begun. In fact, 4 days later, 4 days later, after the zealots had begun their rebellion, they saw those angelic armies in the sky. And then 2 weeks later, after that, on the day of Pentecost, in the evening, when the priests were going into the temple, to perform their pass or Pentecost services in the temple, the sacrifices, it says that the priest heard a loud noise and they felt a strong earthquake. And they heard the voice of a great multitude saying, "Let us go from there. Let us go from here." They didn't see anything, but they felt it and they heard it. And that means that those people were in the unseen realm.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I began to say, wait a second. Who are these people in the unseen realm going from one place to another? Could that be the resurrection of the dead out of Hades? And I knew that 1 Corinthians 15 associates the change of the living in connection with the resurrection of the dead out of Hades. And so I said, bingo, there's the resurrection and the time when the living saints were changed.
Hmm. In a twinkling of an eye.
That's right. At the same moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the dead were raised, imperishable, out of Hades, given their new immortal bodies, and the living saints were changed, translated into the unseen realm, where they joined up with the dead who were raised, and then together as one group, they were caught up to be with Christ in the air. Wow, was that a earth-shaking event for me to understand that. But I still had questions, how in the world were those living saints changed without anybody noticing it and reporting it? So I went back in to the Josephus writings and I started trying to nail down the exact day and hour when these events occurred. And sure enough, I discovered something very interesting. The day and hour when those priests heard and felt that resurrection was Pentecost. It was the day of Pentecost in 66 AD. And as you know, the day of Pentecost is a first day of the week. Ah, where would the Christians have been on that first day of the week? Ah, they would have been meeting behind closed doors because there was a persecution at that point. The Neronic persecution was still going on, and they were running for their lives. And so when they met together, it had to be in secret behind closed doors with no unbelievers present. And you see
Which,
where I'm going with this.
yeah, and you can go to I think it's Acts chapter 1 when Jesus has ascended and the my timeline may be a little bit off, but I do know in Acts they were meeting behind closed doors out of
Right.
fear of the Jews, which is really
Exactly.
common during this time because of the persecution, the eventual killings by unbelieving Israel. Ultimately, Nero became a part of that whole killing. So it's not like the Christians were in the city streets and all of a sudden, oh, there
Nope.
they go. And if Christians would have disappeared at this point in time, that's no big deal among
Right.
the unbeliever because they're thinking, oh, another Christian got killed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's after dark, first of all, when the priest in the temple at night heard those things. And so that's the very time when those Christians would have been in their secret meetings behind closed doors, no unbelievers present. And so, poof, they're gone. And the only thing that unbelievers would have noticed is that they're gone, but they would have only thought that they were snatched away by the Roman authorities and killed, or that they fled for their lives and got out of there to escape the persecution. They would never have, they didn't even know. I mean, unbelievers would not have even known about the rapture. That would never even cross their mind that there was a rapture. They would have only thought that they either were arrested in the night and taken away, or they fled in the night to get away from the persecution. And so that's how it happened. No one who was not a Christian uh, would have even known that it occurred.
Yeah. Now, some people will say, Ed, well, nobody wrote about it.
Right.
And something I got to thinking about is let's take the Jewish-Roman War. Um, had Josephus not been around, nobody would have written about the one of the most significant events in human history
Right.
was the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Had it
Right.
not been for Josephus, we would have no writings about it for the most part
Right.
that I'm aware of.
But
And so
we should have had lots of writings if there was no rapture. Then those Christians would
exactly.
have been left around. They would have experienced the second coming. They would have known about the angelic armies, and they would have experienced those events. So they should have been writing stuff afterwards.
Luke probably would have had, the book of Luke, the book of Acts. He probably would have had Acts 2,
Yeah, that's right. Acts chapter or volume two, Acts
volume
volume
2.
two
Yeah.
and three, maybe. So that silence has baffled so many historians, patristic historians. For instance, Philip Schaff in his 8 volume set of church history bemoans the fact that we just don't have any writings coming from that first 30 years after 70 AD. He says that's the most significant period in church history, and yet we don't have any information about it. He says we have lots of information in the second century and third century, but he says we don't have anything in those 30 years right after 70 AD. He says that's the most important part of our church history because we don't understand how the church got into the second century and how they came up with all these strange ideas that were different than what the New Testament church in the first century believed. And so we have no way to figure out how they got so confused in the second century. It's the period of time that we want to know the most about, but we know the least about. So that
And
was really,
that's because those who would have written had been raptured.
that's
There's
right.
no one to write.
After 70 AD, there's not a single one of those pre 70 Christians who show up and say anything.
Yeah.
There's over 80 Christians by name in the New Testament, close to 100 people who are named, but 80 of them for sure were Christians, and not a single one of them show up after 70 AD
Yeah.
to say anything, write anything. And some of them, like Timothy, would have been young enough to have lived almost to the second century, or maybe even into the second century. And a lot of those young guys that traveled with Apostle Paul, you know, had heard his teaching. They would have been able to say an awful lot about it. And they would have gone on missionary trips just like Apostle Paul did. And they would have established new churches. And there'd be lots of epistles talking about all their travels and their missionary journeys. And yet there's none of it. It
Yeah.
all disappears. They disappear without a trace.
Yeah. I want to call people's attention uh, on my website, gracereach.org. You can probably just Google 10 common questions about the rapture, uh, maybe with Grace Reach in there. And I've designed a page because there's a lot of questions that's going to come up. And you've actually addressed the majority, if not all, those questions in a lot of your teachings. So, what I've done with those 10 common questions is I've written out the questions, and I've got access to yours and other people's teachings on their answers to those common objections about an AD 66 rapture. So if anybody wants to go to gracereach.org, 10 common questions about the rapture. But yeah,
Oh,
go
that's
ahead,
great.
Ed. Hmm.
I'm going to go there right after this is over and check it out. That's great.
Yes,
Uh,
indeed.
you know, some other things that occurred to me. I mentioned that I had uh, gone into Josephus and tried to figure out, the exact day and hour when these things took place. What else I noticed is that when the angelic armies were seen in the sky above Judea, it was exactly 2 weeks before Pentecost. Now we know Pentecost was a first day of the week. So 2 weeks before that would have been what? Another first day of the week.
Mhm.
And what's very interesting is that Josephus says that before sunset, they saw the angelic armies up in the sky just before sunset. Now, question, where would the Christians have been just before sunset, which would begin the first day of the week? Where would they be at that point? They would be on their way to their first day of the week meeting, which was a secret meeting behind closed doors because of the persecution. They would be on their way right there just before sunset. And that's when the angelic armies appeared in the sky. So those Christians would have seen the angelic armies in the sky on their way to their first day assembly. Now, can you imagine how excited and how electric their first day of the week meeting must have been?
Mhm.
Did you see that? Wow. Now, in Luke chapter 21, Jesus had told them, when you see these things, look up because your redemption is drawing near. Can you even imagine what they must have been saying in their first day of the week meeting?
And so you put that look up, your redemption is near, e that parallels equals the rapture.
No, look, that
Or it's
was
a,
preparing them. It's saying to them, your redemption is drawing near. And so, sure enough, 2 weeks later, on the day of Pentecost, their redemption did happen. The
which was the
redemption,
rapture.
that's right.
Gotcha. Got
So,
you.
so that was a preparation point. What's interesting in Hebrews, uh, was it chapter 10, verse 25? Apostle Paul writes the book of Hebrews, and he encouraged those Christians, the Hebrew Christians especially, who were in Judea, because the book of Hebrews is written to the Hebrew Christians in Judea. He encourages them to not forsake their assembling together as a church. And all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, if there was any Christians who missed that assembly when they saw the angelic armies in the sky. You you can bet they saw the angelic armies, and they would have been there the next week and the following week when the rapture happened. So I mean, you can bet they did not forsake those assemblies after they saw the angelic armies.
And
They would
so
have been.
the day of Hebrews 10:25 is the day of redemption, the
That's
day
right.
of the rapture.
Right. The day of his coming. Yeah.
Yeah, what's
That's right.
so important to put these verses within their historical context, because if we don't, we're going to miss the big narrative
That's
and the
right.
larger narrative and the larger biblical story. Um, talking about this narrative, the way the rapture's kind of developed in my mind is Jesus told his disciples that he was going to be taken to heaven.
Right.
So he himself was going to be raptured. He was going to be
Right.
taken to heaven.
Right.
But he told his disciples that I'm not going to leave you as orphans.
Right.
I'm going to come back, and there's your second coming. I'm going to come back and take you to be where I am. So their expectation was to that Jesus was going to come back and take them to be with him. Well, then that message grew to all believers. So
Right.
now believers share in that same hope
Right.
that Jesus was going to come back, take them to be with Christ. And this was going to happen because what Paul talks about is Jesus was coming back to do two things for believers, to bring relief and to rescue prior
That's
to
right.
the wrath against first century unbelieving Israel.
Right.
So expound on that a little bit.
Yeah. In John chapter 13, you might want to grab your Bible. I got mine here. Uh, Very
Here's mine right
interesting.
here on my phone. I need to go to my Bible app.
Very interesting in John 13. Jesus is explaining to them what's going to happen to them in the coming days as they go out and preach the gospel and make disciples. And he tells them what they're going to have to suffer as a result of this preaching the gospel. And he tells them that they're going to have to, you know, forsake all their worldly possessions, and they'll maybe even give up their own life also in order to be faithful to that mission to take the gospel. And so, that's where Jesus tells them that he's going away back to the Father and to be gone from them, and that, but he's not going to leave them as orphans. He'll appear to them occasionally throughout that period while they're preaching. And we see that in the book of Acts. Apostle Paul, Jesus appeared to Apostle Paul, and Jesus appeared to Peter several times, and some of the other disciples as well. And Jesus appeared to Ananias in Damascus and encouraged him to go down to meet Apostle Paul and remove his blindness and receive him into the faith. So there was many different appearances during that period, between the ascension and his return. But he ultimately would return. And he says in John 14, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. And he says, I'm going to go there and prepare a place for you. You can't come with me right now. You've got a job to do. I want you to preach the gospel, make disciples, and build my church. But there will come a day when I will return. And when I do, I'm going to receive you to myself so that you can live in those places that I've prepared for you. Now, um, notice what in John chapter 13, uh, John 13, verse 36, Simon Peter said to him, after he heard all about this going away to the Father's house, he says, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus answered, Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later. Wow. There's the key. So many people quote John 14, was it or John 17, verse 15, and say, well, there Jesus prays not to take them out of the world. And they don't remember what it says here in John 13, verse 36. Where I go, you cannot follow me now
Mm-hmm.
because you've got a job to do.
Mm-hmm.
But after that job's finished, I'll come back and receive you into myself. You will be able to follow me later. And so that's something that really helped me understand, this whole flow of information and why they were not taken out at that point and what John 17, verse 15 means when it says, don't take them out right now.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
will be taken out later.
Yeah.
And what else is interesting is on that John 17 passage, that was the night that Jesus was betrayed, and they were eating the Passover meal together. And it was that time when uh, Jesus prayed about their staying there and performing that mission, and that Jesus would have be with them and strengthen them and encourage them throughout that period to perform that mission. And then in verse 24, John 17:24, he says, Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, be with me where I am.
Yeah.
Now he's already told the Father, don't take them out right now. But I do want them to be with me where I am. Why? How? Uh, so that they may see my glory, which you have given me, for you loved me before the foundation of the world. So when Jesus ascends, he receives his glory back that he had ever before the world began. In John 17, verse 5, he says, Now, Father, glorify me together with yourself with the glory which I had with you before the world was. So when Jesus ascended, he received his glory back. And he wants his disciples to see that glory when he returns and brings them to be with him. And so that's very interesting on that. I didn't understand that until I took the rapture view. Then I began to put those pieces together in John
Yep.
14 and John 17.
And
Really
that's
makes
what
a lot of
happens,
sense.
Ed. Um, if you're good for us talking some more, we're beyond an hour, but I'd love to keep talking a little bit more about the rapture with you, if you have time.
Sure.
All right. So so Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, he's interacting with the people of Israel. And he's telling the people that their cities are going to be destroyed in some of the conversations because they rejected him as the Messiah, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's picturing judgment on Israel, just like the Babylonian armies came in Second Chronicles 36, Jeremiah 52. So he understands the old covenant law of Moses. He understands Leviticus 26. He understands Deuteronomy 28 through 32. He understands the old covenant judgments upon Israel for violations of the law. Their ultimate violation was the rejection of Jesus as Messiah,
Right.
calling for his crucifixion.
Yeah.
And so that narrative begins to unfold in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that when we come to Luke chapter 19, for example, verses 41 through 44, Jesus is talking about a siege, building embankments around a city. Well, he's not making up this language. He's not pulling this out of thin air. He's going back to Deuteronomy 28, back to Leviticus 26, where God said sieges would be built around the cities of Israel for their violations of the law.
Right.
And then he moves from Luke 19 to Luke 21, which you were talking about earlier, where he had just told his disciples that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, and at the end of Matthew 23, going to be left desolate. The word desolate flows right out of the Hebrew scriptures with the destruction of the first time Jerusalem was destroyed. It was left desolate. The land was left desolate. The cities was left desolate. So when Jesus uses this word desolate in Jerusalem, the leaders that he's talking to in Matthew 23 understood he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by armies. And then he walks out with the disciples and they say, "Oh, look at the temple. It's so beautiful." And Jesus said, not only is Jerusalem going to be destroyed, but the temple is going to be destroyed too. So they then asked him, well, when will the end of these things come? Meaning the end of Old Covenant Israel and the end of Jerusalem and the end of the temple. And then he goes into um, armies surrounding Jerusalem and seeing all the signs, like you said earlier. Talk a little bit, if you would. Um, my understanding, Ed, is he's talking about the tribulation period. They'll be brought before um, the synagogue and councils and rulers and kings, and they'll be flogged and beat. And he's told them these things in, for example, Matthew chapter 10, John chapter 16. It's a narrative that he's been communicating to them almost the entire time he's been with them about the coming persecution by unbelieving Israel on believing Israel. And this time is coming. The rapture was to take believers away prior to the wrath of God on unbelieving Israel. Expand on that some, if you would. Uh-oh, your volume, Ed, you turned your volume off on accident.
Okay,
There you
there
go.
we are. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the language that Jesus uses here is, verbatim what you find in the Old Testament prophets about the destruction of a wicked city and a wicked nation, and particularly in the Babylonian destruction of the southern kingdom, Judea. You see that same language used in Jeremiah, Isaiah, especially Isaiah, in predicting it, and as well as back in Deuteronomy 28 through 32. You see that same language about this coming destruction of the wicked Jews after they become a generation of vipers and a wicked and perverse generation, Deuteronomy says. And so that language about the coming on the sky with the power and great glory is the typical language you find throughout the Old Testament about the day of the Lord, when the day would come, when God would come in a theophany with his angels to destroy a wicked nation. That was called a day of the Lord. And it wasn't just Israel that had a day of the Lord. All of the wicked nations of the Old Testament had their day of the Lord. And that kind of language that we see in Matthew 24 was used about those Old Testament nations when they were destroyed by a foreign army that would come in. It would use that same language about God coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory with his angels to destroy them. And so it's very typical language. So it's not new. Jesus is not using something here new that they were not familiar with at all. And back to the disciples and Jesus, after Jesus had explained to them what they were going to suffer in the process of getting the gospel out. If you go back to Matthew chapter 19, very interesting. Uh, After Jesus had explained what they were going to suffer, the disciples say, wait a second here. This sounds pretty tough. What is there going to be for us if we go through all of this? What's in it for me? What do I get out of this? I mean, you're requiring us to do an extreme sacrifice here. You've told us that we're probably going to die as a result of preaching the gospel. What are we going to get out of this? And they're right to say that. I mean, wow, there's an extreme sacrifice here. What are they going to get out of it? And notice uh, in Matthew 19, verse 27, Peter said to him, behold, we have left everything and followed you. What then will there be for us? And Jesus said to him, or said to them, truly I say to you that you who have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, you can imagine those 12 disciples sitting there saying, wow, King David had his mighty men sit at his table every day, and they helped him judge the 12 tribes. And they're looking at Jesus and saying, wow, you're going to seat us at your table, your heavenly table. Now, what if Jesus had said to Peter and those guys, you're not going to get anything out of this. You're not even going to see me coming back. You're not even going to know that I returned. And you won't get anything out of it except later on down the road, you may realize that you're now in the kingdom.
Mhm.
What do you think would have happened to those 12 guys if Jesus had said something like that? They'd headed for the exit. They're out of here. But when he said, you're going to sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes, do you think they took that literally? Do you think they really expected that to happen? If they didn't, they would have left right then, back, headed for the exits, gone out of there. So you can bet that they took this very literally. They expected that kind of a great reward at his return.
Yep. Then you
And
go to Matthew 5 when Jesus is talking about the persecution. I think it's maybe around Luke chapter, I don't know, 7, 8, or 9 as well, possibly 10. He's talking about the persecution that first century Jewish believers were going to experience at the hands of unbelieving Israel. And he tells them, great is your reward in heaven.
right,
So they're looking forward. Peter does the same thing in First Peter when he talks about the resurrection and the trials and the suffering, and he talks about the inheritance kept in heaven for you. So they
right,
had this expectation that prior to this tribulation time, they were going. It's kind of like today. Believers think, I used to think this, that there's this 7-year tribulation that's coming upon the world at some time in the future. But before that tribulation, believers are going to be raptured and taken out before the tribulation.
right.
Um, I, in my studies of the Bible and eschatology and this narrative, I've just shifted that timeline from the future to, oh, the tribulation time was then for the disciples, because that's what Jesus said. The wrath that was coming isn't a future wrath in our time. It was wrath on Old Covenant Israel,
Exactly.
and which was the Jewish-Roman War and the Romans coming in and destroying, which is exactly what Jesus talked about. And then Luke 23, the ladies of, or the women of Jerusalem, they're crying for Jesus, and Jesus says, and this is in, I think, Luke 23, 26 through 30. He says, "Don't cry for me, cry for yourselves." And he's looking at the siege that's coming on Jerusalem
Right.
in AD 70. And he's quoting from Hosea, he's quoting from Isaiah, that same language that Jesus used, and those same verses are found in Revelation chapter 6.
Exactly. Yep.
Revelation chapter 6, if you lay Leviticus 26 and Revelation chapter 6 side by side, Revelation 6 is the fulfillment of Leviticus 26, of those final Old Covenant
Right.
judgments. So
Yep.
in my mind, God was very merciful and gracious to Old Covenant Israel. He could have destroyed them a lot sooner than 70 AD.
Yep.
But in his mercy and in his grace and his kindness, he didn't want any of them to perish, which we read about in 2 Peter 3, but in his patience, and I think that's why he waited such a long time. Second Peter chapter 3, Jesus is being mocked. Where's the promise of his coming? It's taken a long time. He's not coming. And Peter says, well, understand, you who are mocking the coming of Jesus, that the reason he's waiting is because he doesn't want you to perish. He
That's right.
wants you to come to understand he is the Christ, he is the Messiah.
Right.
So to me, that's what I call the time of God's favor to the nation of Israel. He could have judged them a lot sooner. He gave them 40 years from the time he came to when he came the second time in judgment. So anyway, any final thoughts as we wrap up, Ed?
No, I think that's good. I'm sure there'll be more questions in the future, so we can look at those whenever we get back together again.
Hey, tell us real quick, maybe a couple of things. One, what would be your words of encouragement to somebody who's just starting their journey, like you did way back when, and I did several years ago? What would be your encouragement? And then tell us what your books are, what your website is, and so people can be directed in your podcast and just learn more from you.
Yeah, I think the best thing is just to read Scripture, especially the New Testament, and read it with the history in mind. Have that timeline of historical events out beside the biblical text as you read through, and put each book in its historical perspective. If you know when each of those New Testament books were written and what period of time that they are covering, that really helps. And look up all the places that are mentioned and look at it on the timeline, the maps. Do as much real study, not just reading the text, but studying the text and then comparing scripture with scripture. You compare Matthew's account with Luke's account and compare Paul's writings with Peter's writings, and they all talk about the same stuff. They just use different words to describe it, but it's the same events that they're referring to. And so the more you get into the historical fabric of the New Testament, the better that message will come out for
Yeah.
you. Uh,
And Ed, this started for me October of 2023. And right around the time of October 2023, I remember telling my wife, I wish I could find some people, because I really have always enjoyed studying the Bible through its historical lens, because I understand that when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're reading real historical documents. We're reading real manuscripts written by real people to real people at a real time. This is real history
Right.
we're reading here. So if we ignore the history of it, which in most seminaries we're told to pay attention to the history. Who's the original writer? Who's the original speaker? Who's the original audience? What did the writer speaker mean? What did the hearer or reader understand it to mean? But that's so often skipped.
Right.
Even though it's emphasized, it's skipped. And when the Bible's opened on Sunday mornings, it's usually an application message, taking
Right.
verses out of their historical context. So I
Right.
remember telling my wife, I wish I could find some people. Within 2 weeks of telling my wife that, a friend sends me a text. Brad, have you considered that the book of Revelation's already been fulfilled? I thought, "Well, that just sounds odd," but I respected my friend. And he said, well, listen to some of these people. Tell me what you think. And eventually I came across you, and you guys all looked at scripture through the lens of history, which is what I was really wanting. So that was neat. So I second what you're saying. That's exactly what happened in my journey, is I
Yeah.
began to say, well, every time the word we or you or us is used, it's not talking about me, it's talking about them. So
Right.
how did they understand it? So
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. The audience relevance is so important. And part of that is the historical background to each of the New Testament books. And I have a little book that I have rights to publish. It's by, uh, I forgot the guy's name, but it's called How to Understand the Bible. And that was one of the first books that we were required to read at the seminary. In our first freshman courses, they made us read through that little book, How to Understand the Bible. And in the very opening chapter, he says, before you begin to try to interpret a scripture, you need to read it in its context and answer 5 questions about it. Number one, who wrote that? And to whom was it written? When was it written? Why was it written? And when you answer those 5 questions, to who wrote it, to whom it was written, when, where, and why, uh, it'll open up that whole book of the New Testament to you.
yeah,
The meaning just flows out of that historical context because if you know when it was written, by whom, and to whom, then you'll know why it was written.
yeah,
And if you know why it was written, you'll understand what the message is all about.
yeah,
And so that was a real eye opener for me. I had already been kind of doing that in my historical studies, but I had really not, focused on the details of it. And that's what really helped me the most. And very few Christians take the time to study and answer those 5 questions. So,
yeah. And I think I'd probably add to that is let's take the book of Revelation, for example. What people think, oh, all this is confusing. And yes, it is confusing if we don't let Scripture interpret Scripture, that the
right,
best commentary on the Bible are not commentaries on our shelves. The best commentary on the Bible is the Bible itself.
exactly.
And so when we read the book of Revelation, has anything that I'm reading in the book of Revelation, has it surfaced anywhere in the Bible prior to Revelation? And we discover that there are over 400 references
Right.
from the Hebrew Bible contained in the book of Revelation. So, well, how's that going to help me understand the scorpions and all this imagery that's being used? Well, how was it used in the Hebrew Bible? How was it used by the Hebrew prophets? And
Exactly.
once we begin to see those, then it begins to make sense. So even when we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Hebrew Bible is part of that historical context. It's part of that narrative that it, it's sort of like, so often people been taught to read the Bible without considering, or that we're told to consider the context many times. Um, I'm losing my train of thought here where I was going with this. Um, but when you open Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's a narrative, there's a story that's been told, and that narrative is continuing. So when Jesus begins to communicate, he's going back into the Hebrew Bible. And so often, we're rushing to make application when the first thing I need is education.
Exactly. Yep,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the historical context is everything. In the field of investments, stock market, they say timing is everything. But when you get to the New Testament, his history is everything. Because
Yeah.
if you don't know the historical background of those words that you're reading, you don't have a Chinaman's chance of understanding
Yeah.
what he's saying. So that's why I focus so much of my time in the past, especially after I took the Rapture view. Man, so much of my time is spent in Josephus and other historical writings of the New Testament, tearing the book of Acts apart, you know, studying it very carefully because the historical narrative in the book of Acts is so crucial to understanding all of Paul's writings, especially because his traveling companion, Luke, is following the travels of Apostle Paul. All three of Apostle Paul's missionary journeys are recorded there. And so if you understand all of that history in the book of Acts, you'll understand Apostle Paul's writings as well. And you'll understand what he meant to all of those churches that he's writing to in all of his epistles, because you'll see that historical background in the book of Acts. So I spent a lot of time. There's a very good book by Arthur Ogden. The title of it is The Development of the New Testament, in which he does that very thing. He goes through the book of Acts and all of Paul's epistles and all of the New Testament epistles, Peter as well, and shows he pulls out of those writings the historical narrative and lays it out in a timeline form so that you can plug in each of those New Testament books into that timeline.
Yep.
And that was an extremely helpful study for me. The book is out of print right now, but I was told by Arthur Ogden's son that they'll be putting that back in print here pretty soon. And when it does, it's going to be added to my book list on our website. But that was extremely helpful book. I used it a lot in building my book, The Final Decade,
Yeah.
before the end. That book draws from Arthur Ogden's book a
So
lot.
tell us about your books. Where can people get your books? What's your website?
Yeah, the website is real simple. It's preterist.org.
And would you do me a favor? Define preterist and full preterist for us real quick.
Yeah,
If you can do that in a short time.
sure. Yeah, the word preterist is a Latin word, Latin derivative. You'll hear it in Spanish, especially. If you talk to Spanish speaking people, they'll know what preterist means. It just means the past, in the past and fulfillment in terms of Bible prophecy. Bible prophecy is fulfilled in the past. So it's past fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It's a very technical term, but if you're Spanish, you know what it means. Past and fulfillment.
Gotcha. And full preterism, partial preterism is the belief that most of the book of Revelation has been completed.
Right.
Um, Even some partial preterists would say, "Hey, we're living on the new covenant, heaven and earth
Right.
now, but we're still waiting a coming of Christ." Whereas your full preterist would say, "Hey, we are living on the new heaven and earth now,
Right.
but we believe the kingdom, which is started as a stone in Daniel 2 and grows into a mountain, is an everlasting kingdom that continues, that the
Right.
gospel is continuing, and we're sharing the gospel, and the water of life is flowing from heaven through us, the New Jerusalem, the believers in Christ, to those outside the New Jerusalem. The gates are always open, and anybody can come and drink of the water of life and enter into the family of God, the New Jerusalem. And so we're going to continue to share the gospel. But our ultimate destiny is to be in heaven. That's our citizenship.
Right.
Philippians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so many people think that when we become full preterist, we lose our hope. You know, not at all. We have the same hope that all Christians have. That is to go to heaven, be with Christ, and live with him forever.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed at all. Being a full preterist doesn't take away our hope. We have the same hope.
Well, and I think understanding fulfilled prophecy, so many people live in fear of this antichrist that's coming and this seven
Yeah.
year tribulation and this peace treaty and people being raptured and planes crashing and buses crashing and teachers teaching in front of a elementary class and now the teacher's gone and just chaos. I don't know how that's hope. I don't
Right.
see any hope. I see fear. But that's really, they're looking for this quote, wrath that the Bible doesn't talk about.
Right.
But it does talk about wrath, which was the end of Old Covenant Jerusalem,
Right.
Israel. That's that wrath that it's just been misinterpreted by Bible teachers for so
Right.
long that it's become second nature to us. So I encourage those who are listening to this podcast or watching a video, um, check it out, study like you were saying, look at the history, look at the narrative, look at the time statements. What's your website?
Yeah. Yeah. The website is preterist.org. Yeah. www.preterist.org.
Okay, sounds great. My website is gracereach.org. I also have books there. You can go check out my books. I highly recommend Ed's books. You can get them right off his website as well. Ed and I will probably be talking some more. We'll hopefully do some more videos over the course of time and just continue to talk about our journeys of eschatology, help other people on their journeys of eschatology. And so I appreciate you, Ed. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a real big pleasure here. Enjoyed it very much. Looking forward
Awesome.
to more.
Hey, we'll see you next time, my friend.
Okay, thanks.